When considering the impression of poetry on a broader spectrum outside that of literature itself, few individuals come to mind ahead of poet Langston Hughes. A product and beneficiary of the intellectual, social, and artistic explosion that defined the Harlem Renaissance, Hughes emerged as a central figure in the advancement of the African American community during a period of much transition and progression. Through various mediums of literature, ranging from novels and short stories to poems and plays, Hughes provides a strikingly raw, unembellished portrayal of the toil and tribulations that characterize life as a working-class African American. His understanding and application of various literary techniques, coupled with the brutally candid yet empathetic nature of his works, allowed for the content to serve its intended purpose, to stand as a token of defiance against white American dominance, whilst enlightening fellow African Americans, particularly those in the working class, that the unjust disposition they found themselves in was by no means fair. The efficacy and success of his work on the social and political front can be attributed in part to a recurring theme and technique employed in much of his writing, that of collective memory. Collective memory refers to the knowledge, information, and memory shared exclusively by a social group. Generally understood as an inherent component of a group's identity, it serves as a symbol of union within a population, its members having experienced a common memorable event. In this sense, Hughes utilizes his position as a working-class African American to his advantage, cementing his credibility as a poet for the social movement while appealing to those in a similar position to himself. His poems generally reflect the hardships faced by most African Americans living in America at the time. By appealing to his audience's desire for empathy and understanding, Hughes is able to establish an affinity and connection with this community, particularly those in the working class. Aunt Sue's Stories captures Hughes' intent to produce and publish content that appeals to the African American community through collective memory. The poem features and follows the life of Aunt Sue, an African American woman who had experienced the horrors and atrocities of slavery, and eventually cuddles a brown-faced child to her bosom and tells him stories of her experience. Hughes' presentation of Aunt Sue as a protective motherly figure helped shape the sense of familial bond and interconnectedness with his intended audience. Hughes methodically depicts the protagonist as an aunt in order to further reinforce her portrayal as an embodiment of black culture. The expression auntie was often seen as a term of endearment in black culture. As he listens to Aunt Sue recount her experiences with slavery, the dark-faced child realizes that she never got her stories out of any book at all. Rather, they came right out of her own life. Hughes refers to the collective memory of slavery as he writes and appeals to the African American population, implying that, like much of his audience, he was also directly impacted by the effects of slavery. While Hughes identifies with plain black people and consequently his writing was generally directed towards the average working class African American, Aunt Sue's Stories targets the black community in its entirety. By creating a sense of family and community with his readers and alluding to the collective memory of slavery, Hughes makes explicit his intent to establish credibility as a representative of the African American community and attract interest and support from those he was able to empathize with. As he writes to the African American community, Hughes also addresses his identity, or lack thereof, as a black man living in America. I, too, provides a brief, insightful look into Hughes's perspective on the identity of a black man's position relative to that of the white man. Speaking from the viewpoint of a slave or domestic servant, he initially refers to himself as the darker brother. While highlighting a distinction between himself and white Americans, Hughes acknowledges their inherent commonality as man and considers himself to be a brother. He goes on to point out that even though they send him to eat in the kitchen when company comes, he laughs and eats well and grows strong. Hughes alludes to his experience with racial segregation, a common practice that belittled and dehumanized the African American population. And although Hughes finds himself the victim of discrimination or racialism, he believes he is able to overcome those challenges and develop and fortify his emotional and spiritual self. He concludes the poem noting that they'll see how beautiful he is and be ashamed, suggesting that those who have established superiority over the black community will soon realize that Hughes and his readers have been the victims of an unjust, inhumane practice. He ends with the statement, "I too am America," signaling his allegiance to the country that has been far from benevolent or supportive to himself and his intended audience. Hughes understands that, similar to many of his readers, America has stripped and devalued much of his identity, and while he remains uncertain of his own worth, he feels a sense of patriotism and hopes that the country and its people will realize that the idea of inferiority amongst members of different races does not and should not exist. Through I Too, Hughes voices his empathy and understanding of the African Americans' current predicament and resonates the thoughts of many of his readers. Hughes's conflicting thoughts and emotions towards America are made clear once more through O Vide Be Mide too. The poem, which is structured in the format of a letter, is written from the perspective of an African American soldier who, like many of his black comrades shortly after World War II, undergoes an internal conflict regarding his impending arrival back home to America. The speaker discusses his contributions to the war effort and reveals that he has driven back the Germans and the Japs from Burma to the Rhine, and on every battle line dropped defeat into the fascists' laps. He points out that the fact that he is a Negro man out to defend his land, the same land that refuses to acknowledge and provide basic rights and freedoms to his brothers and sisters, is confusing. Considering the ongoing injustice that persists back home, the speaker desires to know whether, upon achieving victory and returning to America, he and the rest of the African American population will have to endure the same treatment. He asked, "Will the Jim Crow law still stand? Will Dixie lynch me still when I return? Or will you comrades in arms from the factories and the farms have learned what this war was fought for us to learn?" The soldier understands the injustice and iniquity in fighting for his country and having to experience additional tribulation upon arriving home from war. He ponders the aftermath of the conflict and expresses his desire to return to a nation without segregation, one that welcomes and accepts the African American community. Will Vide Be Mide follows the recurring theme of collective memory and identity and delves into the thoughts and concerns of African American soldiers amidst a period of racial tension and discrimination. Hughes alludes to the experiences of many of his readers as he addresses the injustice that much of his audience experienced during the time of the poem's publication. By writing from the perspective of an African American soldier, he underlines his status as a working-class African American who is able to empathize with the reader. Hughes, who credited Walt Whitman for much of his literary style and technique, led the forefront of the artistic movement during the Harlem Renaissance. Unlike other notable black poets during the time, such as Claude McKay or Jean Toomer, Hughes refused to differentiate between his personal experience and the common experience of Black America. He wanted and intended to tell the stories of his people in ways that reflected their actual culture, including their love of music, laughter, and language itself, alongside their suffering. A leader at the forefront of both the artistic and political movement, Langston Hughes helped lay the foundation for the development of the African American community. Through his harsh yet brutally honest reflection of life as a working-class African American and his incorporation of collective memories and identity, Hughes appealed to much of the Black community and established his authority as a speaker for his targeted audience.